Welcome, dear reader. There are murders that announce themselves loudly, broken doors, scattered furniture, the unmistakable copper scent of blood hanging heavy in the air. And then there are murders that whisper, quietly, patiently, with all the elegance of a man who has waited years to see justice done in his own particular way. This is one of the latter. A prominent politician, Sir Edmund Hargrove, was found slumped over his writing desk on a grey London morning, his speech half-drafted, his inkwell untouched, and a single peacock quill still resting between his fingers. No forced entry, no struggle, no witnesses, only silence and the faint smell of dying embers in the fireplace. Scotland Yard was baffled, but Scotland Yard, as Mr. Sherlock Holmes was fond of reminding them, he had a rather unfortunate habit of looking at everything and seeing nothing. So, if you enjoy a mystery that hides its teeth behind a gentleman's smile, pull your chair closer to the fire, pour yourself something warm, and turn the page. The game, as they say, is afoot. Welcome, dear reader. There are murders that announce themselves loudly, broken doors, scattered furniture, the unmistakable copper scent of blood hanging heavy in the air. And then there are murders that whisper, quietly, patiently, with all the elegance of a man who has waited years to see justice done in his own particular way. This is one of the latter. A prominent politician, Sir Edmund Hargrove, was found slumped over his writing desk on a grey London morning, his speech half-drafted, his inkwell untouched, and a single peacock quill still resting between his fingers. No forced entry, no struggle, no witnesses, only silence and the faint smell of dying embers in the fireplace. Scotland Yard was baffled, but Scotland Yard, as Mr. Sherlock Holmes was fond of reminding them, had a rather unfortunate habit of looking at everything and seeing nothing. So if you enjoy a mystery that hides its teeth behind a gentleman's smile, pull your chair closer to the fire, pour yourself something warm, and turn the page. The game, as they say, is afoot. The Quill and the Quiet Death. The morning of the 14th of November, 1903, began as most London mornings did in that particular season, grey, damp, and thoroughly indifferent to the affairs of men. A thin fog had crept up from the Thames overnight and settled itself along the streets of Westminster like an uninvited guest who had no intention of leaving before noon. The gas lamps were still burning when the first constable arrived at number 14 Caldwell Square, though the sun had technically risen some 40 minutes prior. It simply had not bothered to make itself visible. It was Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, who had found him. She told the constable, and later told Holmes and myself with considerably more trembling, that she had knocked on the study door at 7:30, as was her custom, carrying Sir Edmund Hargrove's morning tea on a silver tray. She had received no answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. It was only when she pressed her ear to the heavy oak door and heard not even the scratch of a quill or the shuffling of papers that she felt the first cold finger of unease trace itself down her spine. Sir Edmund was always awake by 6, always working by 7. In 11 years of service, Mrs. Prentice had never once known him to sleep past sunrise. She opened the door. Sir Edmund Hargrove, Member of Parliament for the constituency of North Ashford, distinguished veteran of 2 parliamentary committees, and a man whose name had appeared in the Times no fewer than 30 occasions in the past calendar year alone, was sitting at his writing desk in his high-backed leather chair. His head was tilted slightly forward, as though he had simply paused mid-thought and allowed his chin to dip toward his chest. One hand rested flat upon the desk beside a half-filled sheet of paper. The other hand, his right, still loosely held a long peacock quill, its iridescent feather catching what little grey light came through the curtains. He looked, Mrs. Prentice would say, almost peaceful. He was, of course, quite dead. Holmes and I had been summoned by Inspector Lestrade shortly before 9 o'clock that morning. I was in the middle of my second cup of tea at Baker Street when Holmes appeared in the doorway of my room, already dressed, already wearing that particular expression he reserved for moments when something had caught his attention. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of sharp, focused stillness, like a hunting dog that has caught a scent and gone very quiet. "There is a dead politician in Westminster," he said, as though commenting on the weather. "Lestrade believes it is natural causes. I do not believe Lestrade." I set down my cup. 20 minutes later, we were in a hansom cab rattling through the fog toward Caldwell Square. Holmes said very little during the journey, which was not unusual. He sat with his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin and his grey eyes fixed on some middle distance that existed, I suspected, entirely inside his own mind. I had learned, over many years of friendship and collaboration, that these silences were not empty ones. Holmes was never idle, even when he appeared to be doing nothing whatsoever. He was thinking, arranging, preparing. "What do you know of Sir Edmund Hargrove?" I asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. Holmes did not look at me. "Enough," he said. Then, after a pause, "And perhaps not enough. We shall see." It was an oddly uncertain answer for him, and I noticed it, though I said nothing. Number 14, Caldwell Square, was a handsome Georgian townhouse, 4 stories tall with iron railings, and a freshly painted black door that seemed almost offensive in its cheerfulness given the circumstances. 2 constables stood outside. A small cluster of neighbours had gathered on the pavement opposite, wrapped in coats and whispering to one another with the barely concealed excitement that sudden death tends to produce in otherwise respectable people. Lestrade met us in the entrance hall, a compact, sharp-featured man with the perpetual expression of someone who is quite certain he already knows the answer, and is merely tolerating the conversation as a formality. "Glad you've come, mister." "Holmes," he said, though his tone suggested he was only partially glad. "Though I suspect you'll find this rather less dramatic than you're hoping. The man was 61 years old, worked 18-hour days, and had the colour of someone who hadn't seen a vegetable since the previous administration. Heart, most likely. The doctor who examined him this morning said as much." "The doctor," Holmes said pleasantly, "is welcome to his opinion." Lestrade's mouth thinned slightly. He led us up the staircase. The study was on the first floor, a large, well-appointed room that smelled of old books, pipe tobacco and wood smoke. The fireplace held the grey ash of a fire that had burned down to nothing sometime during the night. 2 tall windows faced the square, their curtains half drawn. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled not with the decorative volumes that wealthy men sometimes purchased by the yard, but with genuinely worn, genuinely read books, legislation, political history, parliamentary records going back decades. Sir Edmund was still in his chair. The police surgeon had not yet moved him. Holmes crossed the room in 5 long strides and crouched beside the body, studying the dead man's face, with an attention that most people reserve for things considerably more animated. I followed and conducted my own examination from a physician's perspective. The face showed none of the congestion or distortion I might expect from cardiac arrest. The lips held a very faint bluish tinge, subtle enough that a cursory examination might miss it entirely, but present nonetheless. "Holmes," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied without looking up. "I see it." He turned his attention to the desk. The half-written speech lay there, neat, careful handwriting, the sentences breaking off mid-paragraph as though the author had simply paused and never resumed. The inkwell sat to the left, its stopper beside it. Holmes uncapped it, examined it briefly, replaced the stopper. Then he looked at the quill. He did not touch it immediately. He simply looked at it for a long moment, at the feather, at the nib, at the very tip of the feather end, which was slightly damp and carried the faint impression of teeth marks. "Watson," he said slowly, almost to himself. "A man who chews his pen." "Many men do," I said. "Yes," Holmes agreed. He straightened up and stood very still in the middle of the room, his eyes moving across every surface with the systematic thoroughness of a man reading a page. "Many men do." He did not say anything further, but something in his expression had shifted. That peculiar stillness had deepened into something I could only describe as cautious. Not uncertain exactly, but not yet certain either. He turned to Lestrade. "The quill is not to be touched by anyone. I want it preserved exactly as it is and sent to my contact at the university laboratory before this afternoon. I shall arrange it." Lestrade frowned. "It's just a pen, Mr. Holmes." Holmes looked at him with an expression of almost serene patience. "Inspector," he said, "if I am correct, that pen is the murder weapon. And if I am wrong," he picked up his hat from where he had set it on the corner of the desk, "then you may feel entirely free to remind me of the fact at your earliest convenience." He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame, surveying the room one final time. Something was nagging at him. I could see it in the slight crease between his brows, that small, barely visible furrow that appeared when a thing was not yet adding up the way it ought to. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "We have calls to make, and I find I have more questions than I'm entirely comfortable with." From Holmes, that was a remarkable admission. I followed him down the stairs and back out into the fog, and somewhere above us in that silent study, a peacock quill rested on a dead man's desk, keeping its secret a little longer. Old enemies. Older sins. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a household after sudden death. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, nor the peaceful silence of a sleeping house, but something heavier and more complicated than either. It is the silence of people who are not certain what they are permitted to feel, and so have chosen, for the time being, to feel nothing at all visibly. The servants of number 14, Caldwell Square, wore this silence like a second uniform when Holmes and I returned that afternoon. Holmes had spent the intervening hours, while I attended to a patient on Harley Street, and returned to Baker Street for a change of coat, doing what Holmes did when a problem had not yet revealed its shape to him. He had read 3 newspapers, 2 parliamentary records from the previous session, and what appeared to be a privately printed biography of Sir Edmund Hargrove that he had obtained from some source he did not trouble himself to explain. It was sitting open on the arm of his chair when I arrived, bristling with small slips of paper he had used as markers. "You have been busy," I remarked. "I have been catching up," he said, which was not quite the same thing. He was quieter than usual on the cab ride back to Caldwell Square. Not the productive quiet of a man arranging his thoughts, but something that sat less comfortably, the quiet of a man who suspects he is missing something and cannot yet identify what it is. I had seen this in Holmes before, though rarely. He did not wear uncertainty gracefully. It irritated him the way a loose thread irritates a tailor. The household staff had been gathered in the downstairs sitting room at Holmes's request, 4 of them in total. Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, whom we had already met. Thomas Greer, the butler, a tall, grey-haired man of perhaps 60 with the composed expression of someone who had spent decades being professionally invisible. A young parlour maid named Alice Dodd, who looked as though she had been crying recently and was working very hard not to resume. And finally, a man introduced as Mr. Calloway, Sir Edmund's personal secretary, younger than I had expected, perhaps 30, with a thin face and careful eyes that moved around the room with a watchfulness that I noticed and filed away, without yet knowing why. Holmes spoke to them collectively for only a few minutes before separating them. He had a method for interviews that I had observed many times. He began with general, almost casual questions, the sort that seemed to require no particular thought, and watched how people answered them rather than what they actually said. The words he had told me once are frequently the least informative part of a conversation. He began with Mrs. Prentice. She was a stout, capable-looking woman of 55, with red hands and steady eyes that had been steadier, I suspected, before this morning. She told her story again, the knocked door, the silence, the opening, the sight of Sir Edmund in his chair, with the careful precision of someone who had already told it several times, and was determined to tell it the same way each time, not out of deception, but out of the particular dignity of someone who wishes to be believed. Holmes listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he asked 3 questions. Had Sir Edmund received any visitors the previous evening? Mrs. Prentice thought carefully. Yes, 1. A gentleman had called at approximately 8:30. She had not admitted him herself. Thomas Greer had answered the door. She did not know the name. The visit had lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Had anything in the study been different when she found the body? Anything moved? Anything missing? Anything that struck her even slightly as out of place? She considered this for longer. No, except that the fire had been allowed to burn down completely, which was unusual. Sir Edmund was particular about the fire. He liked it kept going when he worked late, and finally, had Sir Edmund seemed troubled in recent weeks? Distracted perhaps, or anxious? Mrs. Prentice's steady eyes moved briefly away from Holmes's face, and then returned. Yes, she said quietly. He had seemed troubled for perhaps 3 weeks. She had noticed it in small ways. He had been short-tempered with the staff, which was not his custom. He had taken to locking his study during the day, which he had never previously done. And on 2 occasions she had heard him speaking in raised, agitated tones on the telephone, though she could not. And her expression made clear she would not, even if she could, say what had been discussed. Holmes thanked her and let her go. Thomas Greer, the butler, was a more careful subject. He answered questions with the economy of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that nothing he said could be misinterpreted. And the effect was of someone telling the complete truth, while somehow revealing as little as possible. It was, Holmes would say to me later, a rather impressive skill. Yes, he had admitted the visitor the previous evening. The gentleman had given his name as Mr. Silas Crowe. Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly at the name, though he gave no other outward sign of it. Had Greer seen Mr. Crowe before? No, not to his recollection. Had the visitor seemed agitated? Greer paused fractionally before answering. He had seemed, Greer said carefully, purposeful. Had Greer observed anything unusual about the visitor, his clothing, his manner, anything he carried? Another pause. The visitor had been carrying a small leather case, Greer said, of the sort a doctor might carry, or a man of scientific inclination. He had taken it with him when he left, and Holmes wrote nothing down during these interviews. He never did. But I observed the slight tension in his jaw at the mention of the case. Something had connected somewhere in that extraordinary mind, though he did not yet share it with me. Alice Dodd, the parlour-maid, contributed less to the facts of the matter, but considerably more to its emotional texture. She had liked Sir Edmund, she said, in the uncomplicated way that young servants sometimes like employers who treat them as human beings rather than furniture. He had been kind. He had remembered her mother's illness last winter and given her 3 days without docking her wage. She did not believe for a single moment that he had died of his heart, she said, with a sudden fierceness that surprised both of us. Because he had been strong as anything, and it wasn't right, and whoever had done it. She stopped herself there, pressing her lips together. Holmes looked at her with something that was, for him, almost gentle. "You believe someone did this deliberately," he said. It was not a question. Alice Dodd looked at her hands. "There was a man," she said quietly, "about a fortnight ago. He didn't come to the door, he was just standing in the square, across the street, just standing there looking up at the house. I saw him twice, maybe 3 times. Can you describe him?" She could, and did. A tall man, lean with greying hair and a dark coat. She thought he was perhaps 50 or a little older. She had not seen his face clearly. Holmes thanked her, and she left with the particular dignity of someone who has said more than they intended and is not entirely sorry for it. Mr. Calloway, the secretary, was last. He was composed in the way that anxious people are sometimes composed, very deliberately, with visible effort behind the stillness. He had worked for Sir Edmund for 4 years, he said. He managed correspondence, arranged appointments, drafted preliminary documents for Sir Edmund's review. He had last seen Sir Edmund alive at 6 o'clock the previous evening, when he had left the house after their customary end-of-day discussion regarding the following week's schedule. Holmes asked about the speech Sir Edmund had been writing when he died. Calloway hesitated, just briefly. It was a speech Sir Edmund had been preparing for the upcoming parliamentary session, he said, regarding certain land reform proposals. Fairly routine. Fairly routine, Holmes repeated pleasantly. And yet Sir Edmund was working on it alone, at night, after his secretary had left for the day, rather than during business hours with assistants. Calloway said nothing. "Mr. Calloway," Holmes said, leaning forward very slightly, "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I would be grateful for a direct answer. Was there anything in that speech, or in the political matters surrounding it, that Sir Edmund would have wished to keep private, even from you?" A long pause. Then, "There were things," Calloway said carefully, "that Sir Edmund had become involved with in recent months that predated my employment. Things from earlier in his career. He did not speak of them directly. But I was aware, in the way that one becomes aware of things that are not said, that there was some difficulty from the past that had recently become present again." "A name?" Holmes said. "Did you ever hear a name in connection with this difficulty?" Calloway looked at the floor. Then he said, almost inaudibly, "Merrick." I heard him say it once on the telephone. His voice was... It was not a tone I had heard from him before. Holmes sat back. "Thank you," he said. "That will be all for now." When Calloway had gone, I looked at Holmes. He was sitting very still, staring at the middle distance in that way of his. But there was something different about it now. The earlier unease had not entirely left him, but it had been joined by something else. The first faint outline of a shape. "Silas Crowe," I said. "And Merrick. Or do you know these names? One of them, Holmes said slowly. Crow I do not know, but Merrick. He paused, and I saw the slight furrow between his brows deepen. Merrick is a name that appears in a parliamentary scandal from 1889. A matter of electoral fraud and a destroyed career. I read of it this morning, obliquely referenced in the biography. The man whose career was destroyed was named Arthur Merrick. He was a junior minister at the time. Holmes paused again. He disappeared from public life entirely after the inquiry. No subsequent record of him that I have been able to find. And you believe he has reappeared? I believe, Holmes said carefully, that something has reappeared. Whether it is Merrick himself or merely the consequences of what was done to him 14 years ago, I cannot yet say. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the square below. There is something I am not seeing, Watson. Something that should be obvious and is not yet presenting itself to me. It is... He made a brief, uncharacteristic gesture of frustration. Irritating. I'd rarely heard Holmes admit to such a thing. I said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. It was in the desk that we found the letter. Holmes had requested permission to examine Sir Edmund's study more thoroughly after the interviews, and Lestrade, who had remained in the house in the manner of a man who suspects he is being made redundant but cannot yet prove it, had granted this with the slightly wounded graciousness of someone conferring a favour they resent giving. The desk had 3 drawers on the right side. The top 2 contained the ordinary materials of a working politician: correspondence, draft documents, a personal ledger. The 3rd drawer was locked. Holmes examined the lock for approximately 4 seconds, then produced from his coat pocket a small implement that I had learned over the years not to ask about. The drawer opened. Inside was a single envelope, unsealed, containing a single sheet of paper. Holmes read it, his expression giving nothing away, and then handed it to me without comment. The handwriting was angular and pressured, the letters formed with the controlled force of someone writing in a state of considerable emotion held very tightly in check. It said, "You will remember what you did to me in '89. You have built your comfortable life on the rubble of mine, and I have watched you prosper for 14 years, and I have been patient because patience was all I had. I am no longer patient. What was taken from me will be repaid. Not in money, not in public apology, in the only currency that remains adequate to the debt." It was unsigned. I looked up from the letter. Holmes was standing at the fireplace, examining the cold ash with a small glass lens. He had already moved on. "Holmes," I said, "this is a death threat." "Yes," he said without turning around. "Written, I would estimate, approximately 2 weeks ago, based on the slight yellowing of the paper at the fold. Sir Edmund received it, read it, locked it away, and told no one." He paused. He was either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. "Then we have our motive." "We have a motive," Holmes corrected gently. He straightened up from the fireplace and brushed ash from his fingers. "Motive, Watson, is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one. We know someone wanted Sir Edmund dead. We do not yet know who held the pen." He paused almost imperceptibly at his own choice of words. "Metaphorically speaking." He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back, looked at the writing desk once more, at the empty space where the peacock quill had rested before it was taken to the laboratory. "A man who chews his pen while he thinks," Holmes said quietly, almost to himself. 14 years of patience. A visitor with a leather case, and a poison. He stopped himself, as though catching the thought before it ran ahead of the evidence. "Possibly, we will know more tomorrow." He left the room. I stood for a moment in the silence of the dead man's study, looking at the half-written speech on the desk, and felt, not for the first time in Holmes's company, the particular sensation of standing on the edge of something dark and deep, unable to see the bottom but quite certain it was there. The devil in the feather. The laboratory report arrived the following morning. Holmes had been awake when it came. I was fairly certain he had been awake most of the night, though when I descended to the sitting room at 7:30 he was installed in his armchair, with a cup of cold tea at his elbow, and the particular composed expression of a man who would strenuously deny having slept in a chair if anyone were impolite enough to suggest it. The fire was low. 3 of his pipes' worth of tobacco ash sat in the tray beside him. The parliamentary biography of Sir Edmund Hargrove lay open on the floor where it had apparently fallen, and several sheets of his own notepaper were covered in the cramped, angular handwriting he used when thinking aloud on paper. He looked up when I entered, and something in his face told me he had been waiting. "The report," I said. "Not yet." He gestured toward the breakfast things Mrs. Hudson had left on the side table. "Eat something, Watson. You have that look about you." "What look?" "The look of a man who is about to ask me questions I cannot yet answer. It is easier to tolerate on a full stomach." I sat down and helped myself to toast and eggs, and said nothing, because he was not entirely wrong. But we had been here before, at this precise juncture in an investigation, where enough pieces existed to suggest the shape of the whole without yet revealing it clearly. It was, I had come to understand, the stage Holmes found most privately uncomfortable and most publicly concealed. He preferred to present conclusions, not process. The untidy middle, the guessing, the doubting, the following of threads that led nowhere, was not something he displayed willingly. The report arrived at 8:43, delivered by a young man from the university on a bicycle, sealed in a brown envelope addressed in a precise academic hand. Holmes had it open before the boy had reached the bottom of the stairs. He read it standing up, which was how I knew it was significant. Holmes read things of no importance sitting down. When he had finished, he read it again. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment in silence, and I saw something move across his face. Not quite surprise, because Holmes did not often permit himself the full expression of surprise, but the nearest approximation he allowed, a brief, involuntary stillness, a single, slow breath. "Well," he said. He handed me the report. It was written in the dense, precise language of academic chemistry, and I shall spare the reader its more technical passages. The essential finding was this: the ink in the peacock quill's nib had been examined and found to be entirely ordinary, carbon-based, commercially produced, consistent with dozens of similar products available from any stationer in London. There was nothing in the ink whatsoever. The feather, however, was a different matter entirely. Thus concentrated along the upper portion of the quill's shaft, specifically along the section that a man holding the pen in his customary writing grip would position closest to his mouth. The analyst had identified traces of a compound he described as consistent with a derivative of curarine, a contact-active alkaloid extracted from the bark of certain South American plant species. The compound, he noted with visible academic excitement, that somehow survived even the formality of a written report, was exceptionally rare in Europe. It was not available through any commercial channel he was aware of. It required specialist knowledge to prepare in its refined form. And it was, he wrote, yet in the dosage present on the feather, which had been applied with apparent deliberateness to a specific section of the shaft, capable of causing rapid paralysis of the respiratory system following prolonged skin or mucosal contact. A man who held a pen, who chewed the feather end while he thought, who had done so, in all likelihood, for years. I set the report down. Holmes was standing at the window, his back to me, looking out at Baker Street below. "Contact poison," I said. "Applied to the feather, not the ink. Because the ink could be tested. Because anyone might touch the ink. The housekeeper, the secretary. But the feather, Holmes said without turning, would only ever be touched by one person in one particular way, by the man who held the pen. And specifically," he paused, "by his lips and the inside of his mouth during the habit of a lifetime." He turned from the window then, and his face was very still. "This was not improvised, Watson. This was designed around a specific man's specific habit. The killer knew Sir Edmund, knew him well, or had observed him with considerable patience and attention." "Or both," I said. "Or both," Holmes agreed. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "I want to speak to Silas Crowe." Finding Silas Crowe proved less straightforward than Holmes had anticipated, which did not improve his mood. The name appeared in no directory Holmes consulted that morning. It was not registered at any hotel in Westminster or the surrounding areas. It did not appear in the professional rolls of any society or guild, whose records Holmes had access to through various channels that I had never entirely mapped. For 2 hours, Holmes pulled at this particular thread with increasing irritation, and the thread gave him nothing. "A false name," I suggested, when we had returned to Baker Street after a fruitless visit to a register office in Victoria. Holmes dropped into his chair. "Obviously," he said, with the clipped brevity of a man who has already reached a conclusion and is annoyed that the evidence took this long to confirm it. "The question is whose false name, and why that name specifically?" He drummed his fingers once on the arm of the chair. Crow? A crow is a black bird, associated in the older traditions with ill omen, with watching and waiting. He stopped drumming. Or it may mean nothing at all, and I am reaching. It was, again, a remarkably candid admission. What about Merrick, I asked. The name Calloway heard. Arthur Merrick. Holmes had already retrieved his index, the vast, cross-referenced personal encyclopedia of notes and clippings he had compiled over years, filling several large volumes that occupied an entire shelf beside the fireplace. He had it open now on the table, and a section I could see was marked with several of his paper slips. Junior Minister for Trade and Colonial Affairs, 1886 to 1889. Involved in a parliamentary inquiry in the summer of '89 concerning allegations of electoral manipulation in the constituency of West Haven. The inquiry found against him. He was stripped of his position, censured publicly, and his political career ended at the age of 36. Holmes ran his finger down the page. He had a wife, 2 children. The family sold their London house within the year. After that, Holmes turned the page, then turned it back. Nothing. He simply ceases to appear. And Sir Edmund's role in this inquiry? Holmes looked up at me. Sir Edmund Hargrove was the senior member of the inquiry committee, he said. He presented the findings to Parliament. He read Merrick's censure aloud from the floor of the House. A pause. He was, by all accounts, thorough, meticulous, and entirely without mercy. The room was quiet for a moment. You believe Merrick is alive, I said, and that he is responsible. I believe, Holmes said carefully, and I could hear in his voice the particular deliberateness of a man who has been wrong before and has not forgotten it, that the evidence points with considerable force in that direction. A vendetta of 14 years, a method that required intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, a threatening letter that speaks of patience as a currency. He closed the index. But I am aware that I do not yet have Merrick in this room. I do not have his face, his current name, his address, or any direct physical evidence connecting him to the Quill. What I have is a shape, and shapes, he paused, can deceive. Then what do we do next? Holmes stood. We find the leather case. It was, on reflection, the detail that had been sitting in the back of my own mind since Greer had mentioned it. The small leather case that the visitor, Silas Crowe, had carried into Sir Edmund's house on the evening of his death and taken away again when he left. Holmes had a theory about the case, which he shared with me in the cab on the way back to Caldwell Square. The poison, he explained, in its refined form, would require careful handling. Contact with skin before application would be dangerous to the handler, as well as the intended victim. It would need to be transported in a sealed container and applied with instruments, fine brushes perhaps, or glass rods, the kind of apparatus a chemist or a man with chemical knowledge would possess and carry. A case of that sort, Holmes said, would be distinctive, and distinctive things, if one knew where to look, left traces. Greer received us again with his customary composed efficiency. Holmes asked him 3 questions with rapid precision. Had the visitor removed his coat when admitted to the house? Had Greer at any point been in proximity to the case? And had the visitor gone directly to Sir Edmund's study or paused anywhere else in the house? The visitor had kept his coat. Greer had not touched the case. And here Greer paused, with the expression of a man retrieving a memory he had not previously considered significant. The visitor had paused in the entrance hall briefly, while Greer went to announce him to Sir Edmund. He had stood beside the hall table for perhaps 2 minutes alone. Holmes looked at the hall table. It was a narrow, handsome piece of furniture against the wall beside the staircase, with a single shallow drawer and a surface currently occupied by a silver card tray and a vase of dried flowers. Holmes examined it with his lens for less than a minute before he found what he was looking for. A faint, barely visible ring mark on the polished surface, the kind left by a smooth-based container set down briefly. Beside it, so small I would never have seen it without the lens, a trace of dark residue, waxy in texture. The case, Holmes said quietly, had been opened here, on this table, while Greer's back was turned. He prepared it here, Holmes said, in the entrance hall, while waiting to be admitted. He straightened up. That tells us something important. That he prepared it in advance, I ventured. That he was not certain he would have the opportunity to handle the Quill directly, Holmes said. He needed to have it ready, which means his access to Sir Edmund's study and to the Quill specifically, was not guaranteed. He had to create the opportunity during the visit. He looked toward the staircase. Sir Edmund received him in the study almost certainly, and at some point during that meeting, while Sir Edmund was perhaps called away, or turned his back, or was otherwise occupied, Crow or Merrick or whoever he is, applied the compound to the Quill. "A moment's work," I said. "A moment's work," Holmes agreed, "for 14 years of planning." We had 3 suspects, as Holmes had indicated, at the conclusion of the previous day, though in truth, by this point in the investigation, 2 of them were growing thin. The first was Calloway, the secretary, whose careful watchfulness had caught my attention from the beginning. Holmes had not dismissed him, but his reasoning for the method argued against it. Calloway, yes, with daily access to Sir Edmund's study, would have had no need for the elaborate performance of an evening visit and a leather case. He could have managed the thing far more simply. The second was a man named Gerald Ashworth, a political rival of Sir Edmund's, whose name had appeared in the biography and whom Holmes had identified as having a recent and specific grievance over a land reform bill that Sir Edmund had blocked in committee. Holmes had sent a brief note to a contact in the Parliamentary Press Gallery and received a reply by the afternoon post confirming that Ashworth had been attending a conference in Edinburgh for the past week and had a dozen witnesses. That left Merrick, or rather, it left whoever Merrick had become. Holmes sat in his chair that evening with the index open again and his cold pipe in his hand, and that look on his face that I had come to associate with a problem that was nearly solved, but not yet entirely. Like a key that fits the lock in every respect except that it will not quite turn. "There is something," he said, at perhaps 9 o'clock, to no one in particular. "Something you are missing?" I asked. "Something I have already seen," he said, "and have not yet correctly understood." He turned the pipe over in his fingers. "It is there. It has been there since the beginning. I looked directly at it, and I thought I understood what it was. And I was wrong, or I was only partially right, which amounts to the same thing." He set the pipe down. "It will come." I believed him. It always did. It came at 11:17 by the clock on the mantelpiece. Holmes sat forward suddenly in his chair, not dramatically. Not with any of the theatrical energy he sometimes brought to a revelation, but quietly, with the controlled stillness of a man who has just heard a piece of music resolved to its correct final note after a long and searching dissonance. "The fire," he said. I looked up from my book. Mrs. Prentice said the fire had been allowed to burn down completely, that Sir Edmund never permitted this when he worked late. He was particular about it. Holmes stood, slowly. Sir Edmund was cold-blooded in his constitution. I noted it in 2 separate references in the biography. He felt the cold acutely. He always maintained a fire when working after dark. He turned to look at me. "So why, on the night he died, did the fire go out?" I thought about it. Perhaps he was distracted. The visitor left at approximately 9 o'clock, and according to Greer. Sir Edmund was found at 7:30 the following morning. That is 10.5 hours during which the fire was not tended. Holmes shook his head slowly. A man who feels the cold. Working late on an important speech, he would have fed that fire before midnight. Unless, he stopped. Unless he was already dead before the fire went out, I said. Before 10 o'clock, Holmes said, possibly earlier. The poison, according to the analyst's report, acts within 1 to 3 hours of sufficient exposure. If Sir Edmund chewed his pen habitually while composing, and the teeth marks on the feather strongly suggest he had done so that very evening, then the compound would have entered his system during the period of composition. After the visitor had gone, he began to move around the room with the particular restless energy that preceded his clearest thinking. He sat down to write after Crow left. He worked. He thought. He chewed the feather, as he always did, and within the hour, perhaps less, he simply... Holmes paused. He simply stopped. Quietly, without distress, perhaps without even understanding what was happening, the pen still in his hand. The room was very quiet. "It is a terrible thing," I said after a moment, "as deaths go." "It is a precise thing," Holmes said, and his voice carried something that was not quite admiration and not quite horror, but existed somewhere in the narrow space between them. Whoever did this understood the chemistry, understood the victim, understood that the habits of a lifetime are the most reliable mechanisms in the world. He stopped moving. We need Merrick's face, his current identity, and I think he reached for his coat. I know where to find it. At this hour, I said, looking at the clock. Crime, Holmes said, with the ghost of something that might, in better circumstances, have been a smile, does not observe office hours, Watson, and neither, when I can help it, do I. He was at the door. I set down my book, rose from my chair, and followed him out into the cold London night, where somewhere in the dark city a man who had waited 14 years was perhaps already beginning to believe he had succeeded. He had not. Vengeance wears patience. The address Holmes had was in Bermondsey. I did not ask him how he had obtained it. There were channels Holmes used, networks of informants and contacts that spread through London like roots through soil, and he had long since stopped explaining them to me in detail, and I had long since stopped expecting him to. What mattered was that by 11:30 that night, we were in a hansom cab crossing London Bridge, the Thames dark and wide beneath us, the city's lights reflected in broken fragments on the black water below. Holmes was silent for most of the journey. He sat with his coat collar turned up and his hands rested in his lap, and he looked out of the cab window at the passing streets with an expression I had not seen on him often, something measured and sombre, stripped of the sharp excitement that usually accompanied the closing moments of a case. I'd noticed this occasionally before, in those investigations where the crime, once fully understood, revealed itself to be not merely a puzzle, but a human catastrophe. Something that had begun, years or decades earlier, as an ordinary life, and had been bent so far out of its natural shape by circumstances and injustice and time that it had finally broken in the worst possible direction. You feel sorry for him, I said. It was not an accusation. Holmes considered this with more genuine seriousness than he might once have. I feel, he said slowly, that the arithmetic of the thing is tragic. A man's career destroyed at 36, his reputation taken, his family, his livelihood, his standing, all of it gone, in the space of a parliamentary inquiry. And then, 14 years of, he paused, searching for the word, of carrying it, alone apparently, in silence. He turned from the window. I do not excuse what he has done, Watson. I want to be clear about that. Sir Edmund Hargrove, whatever his conduct in '89, did not deserve to die in that particular chair in that particular way. No man does. A pause. But I understand how a person arrives at such a place, and understanding is not the same as excusing. I said nothing. There was nothing to add. The cab turned off the main road into a narrower street, and then into a narrower one still. The house was a modest terraced property on a quiet road called Angler's Lane. 3 stories, brick, with dark windows, and a small front step worn smooth with use. No light showed at any window. Holmes paid the cab driver, and we stood for a moment on the pavement, our breath visible in the cold November air. He will be awake, Holmes said quietly. Men who have just committed an act they have planned for 14 years do not sleep easily on the first night. He was right. Holmes knocked, not loudly, but with the particular confident rhythm of someone who knows the door will be answered. A long silence, then the sound of movement inside. A light appeared in the narrow window beside the door, growing stronger as it approached. The door opened. The man who stood before us was perhaps 52 or 53 years old, lean and grey-haired, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now carried its history plainly. Deep lines around the eyes, a mouth that had forgotten, somewhere along the way, its easier expressions. He was dressed but not for bed, trousers, shirt, a dark waistcoat, as Holmes had predicted. In his right hand he held a candle. In his eyes, when they moved from Holmes to me and back again, there was something that was not quite fear and not quite resignation, but contained elements of both. He looked at Holmes for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, I wondered how long. His name was not Silas Crowe, it was Arthur Merrick. He had not changed it, not legally, though he had lived under various informal aliases in the years since '89, moving between lodgings in the less conspicuous parts of London, with the practiced invisibility of a man who has learned that the best way to disappear is not to flee, but simply to become unremarkable. He had worked in that time as a clerk, a bookkeeper, a part-time tutor in chemistry, a subject he had studied seriously in his youth before politics had claimed him. The chemistry, as Holmes observed with grim precision, Dew had proved the more durable skill. Merrick admitted us without resistance. He led us into a small, neat sitting room at the front of the house, bare of ornament, scrupulously clean with 2 chairs and a small table and a dying fire in a narrow grate. He sat in one chair. Holmes took the other. I remained standing near the door, not from any practical precaution, but because there were only 2 chairs and the room was not large. Holmes did not begin with accusations. He rarely did at this stage. The evidence was assembled, the conclusion was certain, and what remained was not confrontation, but something closer to completion. He began instead, quietly, by telling Merrick what he knew, not to demonstrate his own cleverness, but because I had come to understand over many years. Holmes believed that a man who had carried something for a very long time deserved to hear it named accurately before anything else was said. He told Merrick about the quill, about the compound on the feather, about the entrance hall table and the ring left by the case, about the fire that had gone out, about the letter, unsigned, in the locked drawer. Merrick listened to all of it without interrupting. His face was still throughout, not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the deeper stillness of someone who has already, in some private internal way, arrived at the end of this conversation before it began. When Holmes had finished, Merrick looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "He knew it was me. The letter. He knew." "Yes," Holmes said. "I believe he did." And he said nothing, and told no one. Merrick's voice was quiet and without inflection. That was like him. He was never afraid of anything. A pause. "I used to admire that about him, a long time ago." "You knew him," Holmes said, "before '89. "We were colleagues," Merrick said. "Not friends. Edmund Hargrove did not have friends, precisely. But colleagues. We sat on 2 committees together. He was capable, and he was brilliant, and he was the most ruthless man I have ever known. And for a time, I did not see those last 2 things clearly enough." He stopped, looked at his hands. "The matter in West Haven, the electoral business, it was more complicated than the inquiry found. There were things done that should not have been done. Yes. I do not pretend otherwise, but there were others involved, men of greater seniority, with greater means of protecting themselves. Edmund knew this. Edmund was on that inquiry. And Edmund," his voice remained level, with the precision of long rehearsal, "Edmund chose which names to read from the floor of the house, and which to leave unread. He chose mine, and the others went free." The fire crackled once softly. "You were made the example," Holmes said. "I was made the only example," Merrick said. "My career, my reputation, my family. My wife took the children to her sisters in Shropshire within the year. I did not blame her. There was nothing left to stay for." He looked up, and in his eyes there was something exhausted and ancient. "I had 2 daughters. They were 9 and 11 years old in '89. They are grown women now. I have not seen them in 12 years. They believe, because it was simpler, because it was kinder, that I am dead." No one spoke for a moment. "And so," Holmes said gently, "you decided that he should be also." Merrick did not flinch. "I decided," he said, "that he should understand what it was to have something taken from him. A career can be rebuilt in time by a strong man. A reputation is harder. But a life," he paused, "a life cannot be rebuilt. I watched him for 14 years, Mr. Holmes. I watched him rise and prosper and be celebrated in the same newspapers that printed my disgrace. I watched him receive honours. I watched him draft legislation from that study, in that house, with that pen." His voice remained absolutely steady. "And I thought, he has never once in 14 years paid a single price for what he did. And I thought, there is only one price left that is adequate." Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "The quill," Holmes said. "You knew about the habit." "I observed him," Merrick said simply, "over several weeks, from the square. The parlour-maid saw me on 2 occasions. I was careless there, toward the end. I needed to confirm what I had suspected from our time as colleagues, that he still worked late, still kept the same hours, still chewed his pen while he thought." "Some habits," Merrick said, and something in his tone was beyond bitterness, beyond irony, something almost philosophical, so deeply fixed in a person that nothing in the world changes them. Not time, not circumstance, not even the knowledge, perhaps, that they are dangerous. "The compound," Holmes said. "Where did you obtain the materials?" "Over a period of 3 years. Small quantities, through separate channels, none of them traceable to a single source. I had the knowledge, the chemistry, the preparation. The application required care, but it was manageable." He looked at Holmes directly. "I am not asking you to admire it." "No," Holmes said. "I did not suppose you were." There was a silence in the small room that was not uncomfortable in the way silences between strangers are uncomfortable. It was the silence of a thing that has been completed, not resolved, not repaired, but finished. The silence at the end of a very long sentence. Holmes stood, slowly, and buttoned his coat. "I am going to send for Inspector Lestrade," he said. "He will be here within the hour, I expect, and I would ask you not to do anything precipitate in the interval." Merrick looked at him with something that might, in another context, have been faint amusement. "I have been patient for 14 years, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I think I can manage another hour." Holmes nodded once. Then, and this surprised me though I did not show it, he said, "For what it may be worth to you, Mr. Merrick, the names you mentioned, the men who were not read from the floor of the house in '89, I will look into the matter." Merrick stared at him. "I make no promises," Holmes said. "The business is old and the men in question are, I imagine, well protected. But I will look." He picked up his hat. "It will not undo what has happened this week. It will not undo what happened 14 years ago. But it is the only thing I can offer that is within my power to offer." He moved toward the door. Merrick said nothing. But when I glanced back as I followed Holmes into the narrow hallway, I saw that the old man's hands resting on his knees in the dim light of the dying fire were no longer entirely still. Lestrade arrived at 12:43. He took Merrick away with the professional efficiency that was his particular gift, and if he was surprised to find the case fully resolved on his arrival, he concealed it with reasonable dignity, and only one remark about Holmes's methods that I have chosen not to record here. We took a cab back to Baker Street. Holmes did not speak for most of the journey, which was usual. But the quality of his silence was different from the silences of the past 2 days. Lighter somehow, and less pressured. Like the thing had been finished. Not happily, not cleanly, but finished. There is a particular kind of rest that comes at the end of a case, even a dark one, the rest of a mind that has been straining against a problem and has finally been permitted to release it. "Do you think he is sorry?" I asked as we crossed the bridge again, the Thames still dark below us. "Merrick," Holmes considered this seriously. "I think," he said at last, "that he is relieved, which is not the same thing and is also not entirely different." He looked out at the water. "He has been carrying the weight of that night for 14 years, Watson. The planning, the patience, the isolation, the long, sustained hatred that must be maintained at considerable cost to the person maintaining it." He paused. "I think some part of him, the part that remembers being a colleague, a father, a man with a future, is very tired. And I think that part is tonight, in some complicated and not entirely comfortable way, at rest." I thought about this. "And Sir Edmund," I said. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Sir Edmund Hargrove was by all accounts a brilliant and capable public servant who did genuine good in his years in Parliament, he said carefully. He was also a man who, at a decisive moment, chose expediency over justice and allowed another man to bear a consequence that should have been distributed more equitably, if it should have been distributed at all. He turned from the window. "History will record the former. This case, in whatever form it eventually reaches the public record, will record the latter. That is, perhaps, the most complete accounting that remains available." The cab rattled on through the dark streets. "It is a melancholy business," I said. "Most of them are," Holmes replied, "when you look at them long enough." He settled back in his seat. "The ones that are not melancholy are simply the ones where we have not looked closely enough." We did not speak again until Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson had left the lamp burning in the sitting room window, as she always did when we were out late. It cast a warm square of light onto the pavement below, the most domestic and reassuring sight in London, to my mind, after a night of this particular kind. Holmes went directly to his chair and sat down with the boneless ease of a man who has been awake for 30 hours and has only now permitted himself to acknowledge it. I poured 2 glasses of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard and set one on the table beside him without comment. He picked it up, did not drink immediately, sat with it in his hand looking at the fire. "The habits of a lifetime," he said after a while. Not to me, particularly. More to the room, to himself, to whatever private audience he occasionally addressed in such moments. We think of them as comfort, as continuity, the small, familiar repetitions that make a day recognizable. He turned the glass slowly in his fingers. It did not occur to Sir Edmund Hargrove, I imagine, that the gesture of a pen between his teeth, a gesture he had made 10,000 times, perhaps more, was the thing that would end him. We are never betrayed by the extraordinary, Watson, only by the ordinary. Only by the things we have done so many times that we have stopped seeing them entirely. He drank. I sat in the opposite chair and looked at the fire and thought about habits, about the 1,000 small automatic things a person does in a day without thought, without awareness, without the faintest suspicion that any of them could be turned against them by someone patient enough, and wronged enough, and alone enough to wait. Outside, London went on about its business in the dark. Somewhere across the city, in a cell in Scotland Yard, Arthur Merrick was presumably doing what Holmes had predicted, sitting and being, at last, entirely still. And in the study of number 14, Caldwell Square, a half-written speech lay on a desk beside an empty inkwell, the sentence broken off at the word justice, which struck me, when I thought of it later, as either the most terrible irony or the most appropriate ending that the whole sad business could possibly have arranged for itself. I did not mention this to Holmes. Some observations are better kept to oneself.